Hello once again, and we're back for the final movement of day 4 of our Classical Days journeys. Hello, Luca. And indeed, we're going to listen to the epic and powerful and impactful fourth movement of the legendary Fifth Symphony of Ludwig van Beethoven. I did want to mention, I did a little checking about Mr. Otto Klemperer between the third and fourth movement, and I realized I was slightly incorrect about his lifespan. He was born in the 1880s, and he actually lived to the early 1970s. So he lived a little bit longer than I thought. These performances of the 9 symphonies that are part of now this CD collection, the Otto or the Klemperer Legacy, were recorded in the 1960s. So they're about a decade less old than I thought they were. But still, we're talking 60 years or so ago when these were recorded. And yes, the fourth movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is an Allegro Presto, meaning fast and then very fast. So it's definitely a movement which features pace and energy and triumphant power. So it is an incredible movement if you haven't heard it. And as I said, I've queued up the last 3 seconds or so of movement 3, which then leads directly into movement 4. So we will hear it as it was originally intended to be heard by the master Beethoven. So let's finish this symphony. This is movement 4 of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which is an Allegro Presto, and it's performed by the Philharmonia Orchestra and conducted by Otto Klemperer. You better cheer, 1960s audience. It's just remarkable. It's such a beautiful symphony. There are few pieces in the canon of Western music that live up to that standard, and ultimately it may not be my favorite symphony by Beethoven, but I understand why for some people it is. I will say one of the details I saw about Klemperer when I did check between movements is that number one, he, as I said, his lifespan is a little different than I thought, but also I mentioned he may have a connection to Carry On, but it is absolutely the case that he was a student of Mahler. So not only is he involved with other, or was he involved with other conductors of significance, but he actually studied under a very famous composer, and that was part of what shaped his sensibilities. I did actually see also that he is considered, or in his time was considered the authoritative performer of not only Beethoven, but Bruckner, Brahms, and Mahler, which makes sense for Mahler, but he actually was not as renowned for his performances of Mozart's work, in part because people felt that he made Mozart heavier than Mozart's music was intended to be performed. So, yeah, it is interesting how his legacy was mixed depending on which composer he was conducting. In any case, I think it's a great performance of the Fifth, and it's interesting to me that I consider it a little slower than I'm used to hearing Beethoven, and yet as far as I could tell and what I read, he was considered the definitive Beethoven conductor. So in that regard, maybe the other ones I've heard are more anomalous and this is more standard. But yes, I suppose it's just a matter of taste and also, the way you've heard pieces conducted earlier in your hearing rather than later. So in any case, I think it's brilliant. Hopefully you enjoyed day 4 of Classical Days. Let me know what you think, and I will see you next time. Peace.